There's no doubt you've heard about climate change. It's been a hot topic of discussion for at least 20 years. We only have one planet to live on, and what happens if that planet becomes uninhabitable due to massive climate change? Although it seems highly unlikely, climate change is very much real, and I'm here to argue that human activity, specifically the meat industry and people's general obsession with meat, is one of the leading causes of human-induced climate change. There are 5 topics that I'd like to talk about in regards to this subject. The first of which being, what exactly is climate change? I'll give a general overview, that way we're all on the same page when it comes to this topic. And secondly, I'd like to talk about specifically what is the effect of the meat industry on climate change. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about the deforestation of our rainforests and what that has to do with the meat industry. And then I'd like to tackle a couple counter arguments that are common when it comes to this subject. The first of which being that climate change is a natural phenomenon and we have nothing to worry about. And then lastly, I'd like to tackle the argument of meat being completely essential for a human's diet. So with that, I'd like to roll into my first point, which is about climate change in general. So what exactly is climate change? It's something we hear about so much it sounds like the end of times is coming right around the corner. But climate is honestly something we deal with every day. If you live in Florida, you probably think it's too hot and humid to live there, and if you live in Alaska, you probably think it's too cold and frigid. Well, that's the climate. Although it may change during the season, generally you think of those areas as being hot or cold. So climate change is going to be the overall idea of these climates changing over time due to one reason or another. Now, climate change is a natural phenomenon, but normally it happens over millions and millions of years, and it's something that we wouldn't really notice in our lifetime, which is completely opposite of what we are seeing now. The issue we are experiencing is that humans are potentially increasing the rate at which climate change is happening. And according to the a synthesis of consensus on human-caused global warming, 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are one of the leading causes of climate change, otherwise known as global warming. Now, the issue that we're facing with that is that if we are indeed increasing the rate of climate change, this is going to be an issue for generations to come, having to deal with reduced ability to grow crops. We've already seen different types of animals going extinct at a faster rate than they're normally going extinct at. So these are all side effects of climate change happening faster than it should be. Now, the next point I'd like to talk about is specifically what the effect of the meat industry has on climate change. We all know how supply and demand works, right? So the more we demand meat from the meat industry, the more they need to increase their supply, which means creating more land for their livestock farms and more land for their food production farms. So according to an article on the Journal of Environmental Psychology, the meat industry accounts for 12% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and that's actually higher than most other human caused greenhouse gas emissions, higher than our cars produce, and some even estimate that 12% is low. It's actually higher than that. So what does that mean for climate change? Well, we've all heard of the ozone layer, and the ozone layer protects us from the sun's radiation and preventing the Earth from actually heating up too much. So with greenhouse gases are actually natural in the ozone layer, but when you release too much of one gas or another, it can disrupt the delicate balance inside the ozone layer, which causes it to degrade and which subsequently causes the Earth to increase in temperature, which has all sorts of ramifications to it. So that's the main issue with livestock farming, is that it's producing so much greenhouse gases that it's causing a tangible effect on climate change. Now, the next point I want to talk about, which is related to the last point, is the deforestation of our rainforest, which has the same effect on our ozone layer that greenhouse gas emissions do. Now, the issue with deforestation in the rainforest is that the cause of the deforestation actually comes from a heavy demand from the meat industry. A lot of the land that is being cleared is cleared for livestock farming and also for soy crops. Now, soy is one of the main feed products for livestock industry. So the more demand there is for meat, the more demand there is to feed the cows and pigs and chickens that are producing that meat, which creates a higher demand for the food products to feed them, which subsequently means that they're having to tear down more and more of the rainforest to create these farms. Now, and there's an article by Damien Carrington on The Guardian who claims that without meat and dairy consumption, global farmland could actually be reduced by more than 75%, and we could still feed everyone on the planet effectively. So that means that we could have more trees, more grasses, more bushes that'll produce oxygen, and which would keep our climate healthy. So now that we've heard a few arguments as to why climate change is being accelerated by human activity, specifically the meat industry, I'd like to tackle a couple of the counter arguments to this subject. The first of which being that climate change is a natural phenomenon. Now, I already kind of addressed this in one of my earlier points, but I'd like to expand on this because climate change is a completely natural phenomenon. There's nothing abnormal about it. The thing that is abnormal is the rate at which climate change is happening. Humans are effectively increasing the rate at which it happens, which is the main issue. Many people will argue that climate change is either not happening or that it's not an issue. And while I do agree that it might not be an issue, it's the rate at which it's happening. Again, I'll say that because that is the main problem. And if we don't stop it, who knows what the side effects will be. And then the last counter argument that I'd like to tackle is the idea that meat is a complete necessity for humans' diet. Now, while this may have been true in the past when we were more of a hunter-gatherer species, technology has changed so much that this is no longer really the case. We don't have to hunt for our food, it's provided for us. We just have to make a trip down to the grocery store and we can get however much we want. But the issue is that we've become almost completely reliant on it. We forget about the hundreds of other sources of protein that are out there to fill that gap in our diet. You don't need 100% meat protein diet. And I'm not saying you have to go completely vegan, but there are other sources of protein that can fill that spot. That way you're not completely reliant on a meat-based diet. So as we can see, the topic of climate change cannot be so easily dismissed as to just being a natural phenomenon. This is, like I said before, this is the only planet we have, and therefore it's our responsibility to take care of it. So through this speech, you have heard me talk about what exactly is climate change, the meat industry's effect on climate change, deforestation and its connection with the meat industry, and I've also talked about a couple of counter arguments, the first being that climate change is natural, and lastly, that that meat is a necessity for our diet. Now through this, I hope to have opened your eyes to this whole topic of climate change. And I hope that the next time you see a steak on your plate, that it'll tell a different story. A story of a planet that is in trouble, and a story of a planet that needs our help and needs everybody's help. Thank you.